To discuss a spanning tree, the first thing you have to talk about is a subgraph, where a subgraph is just a collection of vertices and edges that are contained within another graph. That is, it's a smaller one inside of the bigger one. So, thinking about those last examples we had where we were trying to determine what was and was not a tree, something like each of those null points in the first one could be thought of as a subgraph, as well as something like that 3 circuit in the third one is a subgraph. Or, for other examples here, if we take this guy and we split off some of those edges, we take some of those out, each of those would be valid options for a subgraph. And here, in this context, a spanning tree is a very special kind of subgraph. It is a subgraph that is a tree that contains all of the vertices of the original graph. So, to understand how this construction works, we're going to take a couple of quick examples here, looking at one graph in particular. So for this, we want to find a spanning tree for the given graph below. And we can do this, we can get our spanning tree in a few different ways. Where first, we might want to look at that and just make some careful discernments about the graph itself, that it has 12 edges and 8 vertices. So if we need to get a spanning tree, we will need to remove 5 of those edges in a very special way, in a very directed way, to make sure that we end up still having a connected graph, but a connected graph without circuits. So we could start here by taking that and pulling out the 4 edges around the outside. There, we would still have that circuit in the middle, but we would remove one more. We could pick any one of the ones we want from the inside, and then that would give us a spanning tree, because we have a tree and all vertices remain connected along the path, and there are no circuits. But spanning trees are not unique things. Not in this sense, anyway. We'll talk more about something that can be a bit more unique in a second, but looking at that, we could also take out the inside cycle and then one of the outer edges and result in a different but perfectly valid spanning tree. And that's what the rest of our section, that's what our last bit here is going to be about, is when we talk about these in the context of weighted graphs, then we get some ideas for why we might want to be a bit more careful in determining our spanning trees, because then we might get to the idea of an optimal spanning tree, the best one given a particular arrangement, given a particular setup. But before we get on to that, I do want to mention one quick thing about this graph in particular. We're finishing up, we want to have a little bit of extra detail here, that this is a graph where all of the vertices, as you can tell, are degree 3. This is what's called a cubic graph. And in particular, this is the cubical graph, because with that arrangement, you can think of each of the faces, each of these circuits, as corresponding to the face of a cube, with one outside face around the whole thing. If you pull that part there out into the middle, you'd actually end up getting a box. You get a diagram of a box in this way, where this is a thing called a planar graph, because you have none of the edges crossing each other, and this leads to a lot of really interesting geometric properties in terms of how something like this works, in terms of what something like this can do. But again, that's a bit outside the scope of this class. Still, because we're finishing up here, I wanted to give a bit of time to something that I find kind of interesting that you might not get to see otherwise. Anyway, that's enough of that extra stuff. Let's now talk about our minimum spanning trees. We get a little bit more specific.